There's been countless close calls throughout the Cold War, but few have been as close as this one. It was 1983 and several satellite systems had detected a flight of unidentified aircraft approaching an international military site. This could be nothing, or it could be a massive first strike against the US by the Soviet Union. For American officials, it was impossible to know for sure. But after what felt like hours of agonizing over their options, they found out the truth, and it would change history forever. So what really happened? It all began with a routine patrol over the Pacific Ocean. Soviet early warning radar satellites were keeping an eye on activity around the US Air Force's Johnston Atoll weapons test site. If you aren't familiar with the site, it's located in the Marshall Islands, halfway between Hawaii and Australia. Over the years, it's been used to test everything from small arms to nuclear bombs. But the thing everyone was most interested in right now was a massive intercontinental ballistic missile silo that was being built there. As tensions grew between the Soviet Union and America throughout the 70s, paranoia increased, and if any American knew about the Soviet Union's nuclear weapons testing program, then it was the United States Strategic Defense Command. As such, when two mysterious flights were detected heading straight for Johnston Atoll, they should have sounded the alarm. That is, if they didn't think it was a trap. Over the past decade, the Soviet Union had made a habit of lying about its nuclear weapons tests. They did this to avoid international sanctions. The last thing they wanted was for the world to find out how powerful their new weapons really were, but they weren't very good liars. In 1961, for example, they tried to hide the power of their 27-megaton Tsar bomber, but the explosion was so large that it could be seen all the way in Alaska. There was no hiding something that big. But that wasn't the only time they tried to lie. In fact, it happened again in 1974, and both times the US government suspected that it was just another ruse to cover up a real test. But this time, it was different. These weren't just two planes flying near the testing site. They were two heavy payload bombers. If anything, they were flying straight into it. By the time the early warning satellite relayed this information to the Strategic Defense Command, the decision makers there already knew that this was going to be bad. At that point, there was only one thing to do: sound the alarm. But before anyone could start yelling, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov stepped in. He worked in the command and control center responsible for the nation's anti-ballistic missile system, and he was unconvinced that this was a real attack. Now we need to take a step back and talk about who Petrov was. Unlike many of his colleagues, he hadn't been schooled in military tactics or combat strategy. Before getting his current position, he worked as an engineer. And it was that experience that was about to save the world. Because as soon as he heard the alarm, he knew that there was only one thing to do: gather more data. In fact, he spent the next hour carefully reviewing all of the available data. And once he did, he realized there was no reason to panic. The two Soviet bombers that had been detected near the Johnston Atoll weapons testing facility weren't trying to bomb it. They were conducting a joint training exercise. To be fair, it's not surprising that they had flown so close to the site. The airspace over Johnston Atoll was largely unsupervised, and at the time, there wasn't much difference between the airspace of the United States and the Soviet Union. Basically, each side could fly anywhere they wanted within their own borders. Now, that doesn't mean they did. Both sides were careful to avoid each other's airspace, because the consequences of accidentally starting a war were too great. But with Johnston Atoll being so remote, the two air forces likely had no idea that the other was even there. That being said, they could have handled the situation a lot better. For starters, instead of gathering his own data, Petrov could have immediately trusted his superiors and allowed them to launch an offensive. Technically, this was his job, but given the gravity of the situation, he likely would have been court-martialed for doing so. But Petrov wasn't concerned with that. He just wanted to get to the bottom of what was happening. And after reviewing all of the data, he was confident that there was no cause for alarm. With that in mind, he decided to hold off on sounding the alarm until he could gather more evidence, and that's when things got difficult. According to Petrov, he was almost immediately reprimanded by his superiors. After all, they had given him the order to sound the alarm, and he was refusing. But Petrov stood firm and continued gathering data. He needed proof that this was a false alarm, and he was ungoing to let some angry colonels stand in his way. It took another hour, but eventually he got what he was looking for. At 8:55 a.m., another Soviet satellite passed over the Johnston Atoll weapons testing facility, and Petrov was able to use that data to confirm that there was no threat. His sources told him that the planes were nowhere near the facility and that the previous data was likely a mistake. It might seem easy to just turn off the alarm and go home after hearing that, but unfortunately, things weren't quite that simple. According to Petrov, there were still 2 planes in the area. They had just moved away from the weapons testing site and were headed in the direction of Wake Island. While Wake Island is part of the United States, it was at the time being used as a refueling stop for civilian airlines. But with 2 Soviet bombers in the area, that could change at any moment. Once those 2 planes landed on Wake Island, they would effectively give the Soviet Union a base in the middle of the Indian Ocean, and from there, they could easily spy on American shipping lanes or even launch strikes of their own. Of course, that wouldn't be the end of the world. Even if the Soviet Union had a base there, it would be hard to justify an attack based on that alone. But at the same time, it was a risk that the United States couldn't take. It wasn't worth finding out. So at 9:20 a.m., Petrov called his superiors once again and gave them the new data. Now they had a choice to make. Either allow the Soviets to land on Wake Island or take action to prevent it. And the stakes had never been higher. If the United States decided to attack, then there was a very good chance that it would trigger a larger conflict. Not only that, but if the Soviet Union retaliated, then it could trigger an immediate response from the United States. It was a dangerous cycle and the last thing that anyone wanted. But in the end, it was Petrov's cool head that prevailed. Once again, he gathered more data and was able to determine that the 2 Soviet planes were simply conducting a training exercise. They never even considered landing on Wake Island. Still, there was a moment there where it looked like things were going to get violent. When Petrov first sounded the alarm, the commander of the US Pacific Fleet immediately started making preparations for action. If it came down to it, he was ready to strike. But that meant moving his ships closer to the Soviet bombers, increasing the chances that someone would make a mistake. Luckily, common sense prevailed and the ships remained in port. Still, it was a tense moment and one that could have easily spiraled out of control. But Petrov's calm demeanor and insistence on gathering more data prevented that from happening. Sadly, he wasn't recognized for his actions until long after they had happened. In fact, Petrov was punished for his actions. After all, he disobeyed a direct order when he chose not to sound the alarm. But in 1988, he was cleared of all charges and awarded the Order of Lenin for preventing the launch of nuclear missiles. He wasn't the only one who saved the world either. There was a second Soviet lieutenant who made an equally important call. His name was Vasily Yefimovich Zarubkin, and he served as the backup officer in charge of launching the Soviet nuclear missiles. In the event that something happened to the man in charge, Zarubkin would step in and do his job. But that would have been a terrible thing for him to do because according to Zarubkin, the data indicated that the United States had launched a massive attack, not the other way around. That being said, there was a problem. Zarubkin and his team weren't sure if the data was accurate. In fact, they had a number of reasons to believe that it wasn't. For starters, there was a known issue with the satellite system that they were using. They were also aware that the United States routinely tested its missiles in the Pacific Ocean. With all of that in mind, they knew that there was a good chance this was another false alarm, but that didn't make them any less dangerous. If they were wrong, then they had seconds to get the missiles off the ground before the Americans nuked them all. But if they were right, then they would essentially be giving the United States a free pass to strike them first. They didn't want to do either, but in the end, Zarubkin and his team did the right thing. They resisted the pressure to launch the missiles and waited for more data. When it came, it confirmed what they already suspected. This was another false alarm. Unfortunately, not all close calls like this one have such happy endings. In fact, there was a similar incident in 1960 that led to a disaster. At the time, the Soviet Union had just launched the world's first satellite, and ever since, they'd been obsessed with beating America into space. As such, when an American U-2 spy plane entered Soviet airspace, they were desperate to shoot it down. And they thought they had their chance when another American plane joined the U-2 over the Ural Mountains. To the Soviets, it looked like a perfect opportunity to make a grand entrance on the world stage. All they had to do was hit the afterburners and intercept the 2 American planes. But they didn't do that. Instead, the pilot of the Soviet MiG-21 chose to fire 2 surface-to-air missiles at the 2 American planes. Those 2 planes happened to be a civilian airliner full of passengers. And when the MiG-21 fired, there wasn't a whole lot that they could do about it. The pilot immediately turned the plane around and tried to escape, but the damage was already done. Both missiles hit the plane and it went down in flames. Luckily, all 80 people on board were able to eject, but 60 of them died in the process. That accident changed the world because it was the first time that a civilian plane had been shot down by a surface-to-air missile. After that, every single plane in the world was fitted with special equipment to help it identify itself to enemy airspace. But that still leaves us with a very important question. Do you think the world is ready for a similar incident today? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Be sure to stay tuned for more videos like this one.